The wind carried dust along the desolate streets of Silver Creek as Tabitha Dawson rocked quietly on her porch, her faded blue calico dress hanging loosely on her thin frame, a stark reminder of better days when her husband Thomas had still been alive. It had been 18 months since the smallpox epidemic had taken him, leaving her alone in their modest homestead on the edge of town, with nothing but memories and clothes that grew more threadbare with each passing season. Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1879, was unforgiving to a woman alone. At 26, Tabitha had already lived several lifetimes of sorrow. The drought had decimated what little garden she'd managed to maintain, and the money Thomas had saved was dwindling faster than the creek that gave the town its optimistic name. Her fingers traced the worn fabric of her dress. Once a vibrant blue that Thomas had said matched her eyes, now faded to a pale ghost of its former color. Like her hopes, Tabitha thought bitterly. She'd mended it countless times, refusing to part with one of the last gifts her husband had given her before his passing. The sound of hoofbeats broke her reverie. Tabitha squinted against the setting sun to see a rider approaching, his silhouette growing larger against the amber horizon. Visitors were rare at her isolated home, especially as the townsfolk had slowly forgotten about the widow Dawson, busy with their own struggles. The stranger dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. His clothes were trail-worn but well-kept, and despite the dust of travel, there was something dignified in his bearing. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of sun-bleached wheat. "Name's Henry Gallagher. My horse came up lame about 2 miles back. I was hoping you might have some water for us both." Tabitha hesitated. A woman alone couldn't be too careful, but there was something in his eyes, a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. "There's a well around back," she said finally. "You're welcome to water your horse and rest a spell." "Much obliged, madam." He tipped his head in thanks before leading his limping chestnut mare toward the back of the property. Tabitha remained on the porch, her hands worrying the worn fabric of her dress. She hadn't entertained a visitor in months and suddenly felt self-conscious about her appearance. Glancing down at her faded dress and cracked boots, she felt a flush of embarrassment. When Henry returned, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence. "That's a mighty fine property you have here, madam. You manage it alone." "Since my husband passed," she answered, her voice softer than she intended. "It's not much, but it's home." Henry's eyes took in the weathered boards of the house, the struggling garden, and finally settled on Tabitha herself. His gaze wasn't judgmental or pitying, but appreciative. "If you don't mind my saying, madam, that dress you're wearing," he began. Tabitha stiffened, expecting the kind of comment she'd heard in town about her worn clothing. "You're dressed in my love," he finished, his voice gentle. Tabitha blinked, confusion evident on her face. "I beg your pardon," Henry smiled, a hint of sheepishness in his expression. "That is to say, the color even faded as it is reminds me of the bluebells that grew wild on my family's farm in Missouri. My mother loved them, said they were the color of true devotion." The unexpected poetry from this dust-covered stranger left Tabitha momentarily speechless. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such gentle warmth. "That's a kind thing to say, Mr. Gallagher," she finally managed, feeling a blush creep into her cheeks. "Henry, please," he corrected, "and I only speak the truth." He glanced toward the setting sun. "I hate to impose further, but it'll be dark soon and my horse needs rest before continuing. Is there a place nearby I might camp for the night?" Tabitha considered her options. The nearest town was miles away, and she couldn't in good conscience send a man with an injured horse into the night. "You can stay in the barn," she offered cautiously. "There's clean hay for your horse, and I can bring you some supper." "That's mighty generous of you, Mrs. Dawson." "Tabitha Dawson, Mrs. Dawson," he nodded respectfully. "I won't forget your kindness," As Henry led his horse toward the barn, Tabitha hurried inside to prepare a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved peaches. It wasn't much, but it was the best she could offer. When she brought the food to the barn, she found Henry had made himself useful, mending a broken stall door that had been on her list of repairs for months. He'd removed his duster, and she could see the strength in his arms as he worked, muscles shifting beneath his shirt. "You didn't need to do that," she said, setting down the plate of food. Henry turned, wiping his brow. "Seems only fair to earn my keep. Been too long since I've had a roof over my head, even if it's a barn roof." "Are you passing through then?" Tabitha asked, curious despite herself. Henry nodded, taking the plate with a grateful smile. "Been drifting since the war. Worked cattle drives mostly, but I'm heading north. Heard there's work in Montana Territory." "You fought in the war?" Tabitha asked, noticing for the first time a slight stiffness in his left leg when he moved. "Yes, madam. Union cavalry. Got this little souvenir at Gettysburg." He gestured to his leg. "Nothing that keeps me from riding, though most trail bosses prefer cowboys with two good legs." Tabitha thought of her late husband, who'd returned from the war whole in body but changed in spirit. "My Thomas was at Gettysburg too. Infantry." A look of understanding passed between them, the unspoken bond of those whose lives had been forever altered by the same terrible battle. "He was a lucky man to come home to someone like you," Henry said quietly. "Not lucky enough," Tabitha replied, the familiar ache of loss rising in her throat. "Smallpox took him last year. Seems cruel that he survived the war only to die in his own bed." Henry set down his plate and looked at her directly, his hazel eyes meeting hers. "Life rarely makes sense in its cruelties, Mrs. Dawson. I'm sorry for your loss." His simple, genuine sympathy touched her more deeply than all the formal condolences she'd received from townsfolk. Feeling suddenly vulnerable, Tabitha excused herself, leaving Henry to his meal as she retreated to the safety of her empty house. That night, Tabitha lay awake longer than usual, thinking about the stranger in her barn. There was something about Henry Gallagher that unsettled her, not in a frightening way, but in a manner that made her acutely aware of how lonely she'd been. Morning came with a soft golden light, and Tabitha rose early to prepare breakfast. When she stepped onto the porch, she was surprised to see smoke already rising from the outdoor cooking pit and the smell of coffee filling the air. Henry stood by the fire, his hat pushed back as he tended a pan of frying bacon. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Found some bacon in your smokehouse. Thought I'd repay your hospitality with breakfast." Tabitha should have been upset at his presumption, but the bacon smelled wonderful, and it had been so long since someone else had cooked for her. "That bacon was meant for trading in town," she said, but there was no real reproach in her voice. "Then I'll make sure to leave you something of equal value before I go," Henry promised, serving up the crisp bacon alongside some pan bread he'd made. They ate in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Henry's horse, while still favoring its leg, seemed better this morning, grazing contentedly in the small paddock. "I should be moving on today," Henry said finally, though Tabitha thought she detected a note of reluctance in his voice. "Your horse could use another day of rest," she found herself saying, "and there are more repairs around the place than I can manage alone." Henry studied her face as if gauging her sincerity. "Are you hiring me on as a hand, Mrs. Dawson?" Tabitha hadn't thought of it that way, but the idea had merit. "I can't pay much, but I could use the help for a day or two, if you're willing." "Room, board, and honest work is fair payment," he agreed. "Though I warn you, I'll earn my keep." And earn it he did. Over the next 2 days, Henry repaired the leaking roof, rebuilt the chicken coop, and fixed the broken pump at the well. He worked from sunup to sundown, stopping only for the meals they shared together. During those meals, Tabitha found herself talking more than she had in months. Henry was an attentive listener, drawing out stories of her life before widowhood, her childhood in Ohio, her journey west with Thomas after the war, their dreams of building a prosperous ranch. In turn, he shared tales of his own travels: cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, mining camps in Colorado, the vast beauty of the untamed territories. He spoke without boasting, but his stories painted pictures of a country still wild and full of possibility. By the third day, Tabitha realized she was watching the clock, looking forward to their evening conversations. It had been so long since she'd had genuine company, since she'd laughed or felt interest in another person's words. That afternoon, as Henry split firewood in the yard, a commotion from the road drew their attention. 3 riders approached, led by a heavy-set man Tabitha recognized as Josiah Wilkes, the town's self-appointed lawman and owner of the mercantile. "Trouble?" Henry asked quietly, setting down his axe. "Perhaps," Tabitha replied, her stomach tightening. Wilkes had made his interest in her property clear after Thomas died, offering to buy it for far less than its worth, citing her inability to maintain it alone. The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. Wilkes's small eyes narrowed as they took in Henry's presence. "Mrs. Dawson," he greeted, ignoring Henry completely. "Haven't seen you in town lately. Some folks were concerned." "As you can see, Mr. Wilkes, I'm perfectly well," Tabitha replied coolly. Wilkes finally acknowledged Henry with a suspicious glare. "And who might this be?" Before Tabitha could answer, Henry stepped forward, extending his hand. "Henry Gallagher, just passing through and helping the widow with some repairs." Wilkes pointedly ignored the outstretched hand. "We take care of our own in Silver Creek, stranger. The widow doesn't need outsiders hanging around. Seems to me she needed a roof that doesn't leak," Henry replied evenly, lowering his hand, "and a well that works properly." "Is that so?" Wilkes looked at Tabitha accusingly. "You never mentioned needing help, Mrs. Dawson. The town would have provided assistance." "For a price," Tabitha said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Just like your offer to buy my land for half its value." Wilkes's face reddened. "I was doing you a favor. A woman alone can't manage a property this size." "She seems to be managing just fine," Henry observed, his tone casual but his stance protective as he moved slightly closer to Tabitha. The tension stretched between them until one of Wilkes's companions, a younger man with a nervous demeanor, spoke up. "We should head back, Josiah. Storms brewing to the west." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising a much-needed but potentially violent spring storm. Wilkes hesitated, then turned his horse. "You'd be wise to be on your way soon, stranger. Silver Creek isn't friendly to drifters." With a final glare, he led his men back toward town. As they disappeared down the road, Tabitha released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm sorry about that. Mr. Wilkes has had his eye on this property since Thomas passed." Henry's expression was thoughtful. "Men like that are used to getting their way. You've done well standing up to him on your own." "Not well enough," Tabitha admitted. "The taxes are due in 2 months, and I don't have nearly enough set aside." Henry glanced at the darkening sky. "That storm's coming fast. We should secure everything before it hits." Together, they worked quickly, bringing the chickens into their newly repaired coop, covering the woodpile, and ensuring the barn doors were tightly fastened. By the time they finished, the first fat droplets of rain were falling, and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. "Your horse should be fine in the barn," Tabitha said as the rain began to fall more heavily. "You'd better come inside before you're soaked through." It was the first time Henry had entered her home. Tabitha suddenly saw it through his eyes: the faded curtains, the worn furniture, but also the small touches that made it hers. Dried wildflowers in a jar, a patchwork quilt draped over a chair, a shelf of well-loved books. "It's not much," she began apologetically, but Henry shook his head. "It's a real home," he said simply. "Something I haven't had in a long while." The storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows as lightning illuminated the darkened room in bright flashes. Tabitha lit the lamps and stoked the fire in the small stove, grateful for the wood Henry had split that afternoon. Storm like this could last all night, Henry observed, removing his damp coat and hanging it near the fire. Tabitha nodded, suddenly aware of the impropriety of having a man in her home after dark. But the alternative was sending him to the barn in a deluge, and she couldn't bring herself to do that. "You can take the chair by the fire," she offered, busying herself with preparing a simple supper of stew and biscuits from the previous day. As they ate by lamplight, the conversation flowed easily between them. Henry asked about her garden, offering suggestions for vegetables that might grow better in the dry climate. Tabitha found herself sharing her fears about losing the property, about facing an uncertain future alone. "What would you do if you had to leave here?" Henry asked gently. Tabitha had considered this question many sleepless nights. "I have a cousin in Denver who's offered me a place. She runs a boarding house. I could help with the cooking and cleaning." "Is that what you want?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted in a very long time. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to stay here. This land was Thomas's dream, but it became mine too. I love the open sky, the mountains in the distance, even the harshness of it. It feels like freedom." Henry's eyes never left her face as she spoke, and Tabitha felt as if he truly saw her not as a pitiful widow in faded clothes, but as a woman with dreams and determination. "I believe you'll find a way to keep it," he said finally. "You have more strength than you know." His words warmed her more than the fire, and for the first time in months, Tabitha felt a flicker of hope. The storm raged through the night, wind howling around the eaves of the small house. Tabitha insisted Henry take the small spare room while she retired to her bedroom. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with thunder and a pair of kind hazel eyes. She woke to stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and a spectacular sunrise that painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air smelled of wet earth and new possibilities. In the kitchen, she found Henry already awake, coffee brewing on the stove. He'd shaved, his jaw smooth and younger looking without the trail dust and stubble. "Good morning," he greeted, pouring her a cup of the strong coffee. "Thought I'd check the property for storm damage after breakfast." They ate quickly, both eager to assess the aftermath. Outside, puddles dotted the yard and branches were scattered across the property, but overall the damage seemed minimal until they reached the barn. A large section of the roof had collapsed under the weight of a fallen tree branch, exposing the interior to the elements. Henry's horse nickered nervously from its stall, miraculously unharmed, but the hay storage was soaked through and the newly repaired stall door was hanging at an awkward angle. "This is a setback," Henry said, surveying the damage with a practiced eye. "But fixable. I'll need to cut away that fallen limb first." "You don't have to do this," Tabitha protested. "You've already done more than enough, and you said yourself you were heading north." Henry turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Do you want me to leave, Tabitha?" It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a small thrill through her. "No," she admitted honestly. "I don't." Something shifted in his eyes, relief perhaps, or a deeper emotion she wasn't ready to name. "Then I'll stay a while longer, at least until this roof is fixed." They worked side by side throughout the day, salvaging what they could from the damaged barn. Henry climbed onto the roof to assess the structural damage while Tabitha sorted through the wet hay, separating what could be dried from what was lost. By evening they were both exhausted, clothes streaked with dirt and sweat, but the dangerous hanging limb had been removed and a temporary covering secured over the hole in the roof. "The rest will have to wait until tomorrow," Henry said, wiping his brow. "And I'll need to ride into town for supplies." Tabitha tensed at the mention of town. "Mr. Wilkes runs the mercantile. He may not be willing to sell to you after yesterday." "There are ways around men like Wilkes," Henry replied with a slight smile. "Don't worry." The following morning, Henry rode toward Silver Creek, promising to return by midday. Tabitha tried to focus on her chores, but her thoughts kept drifting to Henry, his quiet competence, his gentle manner, the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious rather than broken. It was dangerous to feel this way about a drifter, a man who by his own admission hadn't stayed in one place since the war. Yet she couldn't deny the awakening of feelings she'd thought long buried with Thomas. When noon came and went with no sign of Henry, Tabitha began to worry. By mid-afternoon, her concern had deepened into fear. Had Wilkes caused trouble? Or worse, had Henry simply decided to move on without saying goodbye? The sound of an approaching wagon jolted her from her anxious thoughts. Relief flooded her as she recognized Henry driving a loaded wagon, followed by a second man on horseback. "Brought supplies," Henry called as he pulled the wagon into the yard. "And an extra pair of hands. This is Illy Parker, a carpenter from town. He's agreed to help with the barn roof." The older man tipped his hat to Tabitha. "Mrs. Dawson, your friend here offered good pay for a day's work, and I never could resist a challenging repair job." Tabitha looked questioningly at Henry, who gave a small shake of his head, silently asking her to wait for an explanation. While he unloaded tools from the wagon, Henry led Tabitha aside. "I ran into some luck in town," he explained in a low voice. "There was a poker game at the saloon. I'm not much of a gambler, but I know when men are too confident for their own good. You won money playing cards." Tabitha asked, surprised, enough for supplies, Illy's help in this. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small pouch, pressing it into her hand. "It should cover your property taxes with some to spare." Tabitha stared at the pouch, feeling its weight. "I can't accept this," she whispered, trying to hand it back. Henry gently closed her fingers around it. "You can and you will. Consider it payment for your hospitality and fine cooking." "This is far more than room and board, Henry. Why would you do this?" His eyes held hers, serious and intent. "Because I've been wandering for years, Tabitha, never staying anywhere long enough to care, but here with you, I care." The simple honesty of his words struck her heart. Before she could respond, Illy called out, requesting Henry's help with the lumber. "We'll talk more later," Henry promised, squeezing her hand before joining Illy at the wagon. Tabitha watched them work together, her mind whirling with the implications of Henry's gift and his words. By sundown, the men had made significant progress on the barn roof, with Illy promising to return the following day to complete the job. After Illy departed for town, Henry and Tabitha sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night was cool but pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of rain, washed earth, and new growth. "I still can't accept this money," Tabitha said finally, holding out the pouch. "It's too much." "What if it wasn't a gift?" Henry asked, his voice thoughtful. "What if it was an investment?" Tabitha looked at him questioningly. "This land has potential," Henry continued. "With proper care, it could support a small herd of cattle, maybe not the grand ranch Thomas envisioned, but enough to make a comfortable living." "I know nothing about cattle ranching," Tabitha protested. "I do." Henry turned to face her fully. "What if I stayed, Tabitha, not as a hired hand, but as a partner in building something here?" Tabitha's heart raced at his suggestion. "You'd give up drifting, just like that." "There's nothing just like that about it," Henry said quietly. "I've been running since the war, never letting myself get attached to anyone or anything. But these past days with you, they've made me question everything about the life I've been living." He reached out, hesitantly touching the fabric of her sleeve. "When I first saw you in this faded dress, something inside me recognized you not just as a woman needing help, but as someone who understands what it means to endure, to hold onto what matters even when it's worn and challenged by time." Tabitha felt tears welling in her eyes at his words. "And that's why you said I was dressed in your love, because of what this dress represents?" Henry smiled gently. "That, and because from the moment I saw you, something in my heart awakened that I thought had died at Gettysburg. When I spoke those words, I was already falling for you, Tabitha Dawson." The confession hung in the night air between them. Tabitha's mind raced with objections. They barely knew each other. It was too soon after Thomas. Henry might grow restless again, but her heart recognized a truth that transcended rational thought. I'm afraid, she admitted softly. Not of you, but of hoping again. Of believing in a future that could be taken away. I understand fear, Henry said. I've lived with it for years. Fear of putting down roots, of caring too much, of losing again, but I'm more afraid of riding away from here from you and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. He took her hand in his touch warm and steady. I'm not asking for promises tonight, only for a chance to stay, to work alongside you, to see if what I feel, what I hope you might come to feel, could grow into something lasting. Tabitha looked at their joined hands, then up at the vast canopy of stars. The universe suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. Yes, she whispered. Stay. Henry's smile was brighter than any star as he lifted her hand to his lips, placing a gentle kiss on her knuckles. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and quiet moments of growing connection. True to his word, Henry invested not only the poker winnings but his own savings in the property, purchasing a small herd of sturdy range cattle and supplies to expand the garden and repair the homestead. Illy Parker became a frequent visitor, helping with the more complex building projects and bringing news from town. Through him, they learned that Josiah Wilkes was furious about Henry's presence, especially after Henry had soundly beaten him at poker that day in town. He's spreading talk that you two are living in sin, Illy reported one evening over supper. Though nobody with sense is paying him much mind, most folks are just happy to see Widow Dawson's place coming back to life. Tabitha blushed at the implication, though in truth, despite the deepening feelings between them, Henry had been scrupulously proper, taking up residence in the repaired barn rather than the house. As spring melded into summer, the property began to transform. The garden flourished with Henry's knowledgeable care, the cattle grew fat on the rejuvenated pasture, and the house itself seemed to shed its air of abandonment, brightening as if in response to the renewed hope of its inhabitants. One warm July evening, Henry found Tabitha sitting on the porch, wearing the same faded blue dress she'd had on the day they met. In her lap lay an open package containing yards of new fabric, a deep blue calico patterned with tiny white flowers. A present to myself, she explained as Henry settled beside her, the first new dress material I've bought in years. It's beautiful, he said, though I've grown rather fond of this one. He touched the worn sleeve of her old dress gently. Tabitha smiled. So have I, though it's hardly proper for town anymore. Speaking of town, Henry said, his tone deliberately casual, Illy mentioned the Silver Creek Social is next weekend. I thought perhaps we might attend, together. The suggestion carried weight beyond a simple outing. To appear together at a social event would announce to the community what had been developing between them over these summer months. Together, Tabitha repeated, testing the word. As what exactly? Henry took her hand, his eyes serious. As a man courting a woman he's come to love deeply. If she'll have him. Tabitha's breath caught. Though she'd felt the growing love between them, neither had spoken the word aloud until now. Henry Gallagher, are you asking to court me formally? I am, he confirmed, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. And I'm hoping that courtship might lead to something more permanent, in time. Tabitha looked down at their entwined hands, then back up at his hopeful face. The man before her was no longer a stranger but someone whose heart she had come to know as well as her own. In him, she had found not a replacement for what she had lost, but a new beginning she had never expected. Yes, she said simply. To the social, to the courtship, and to whatever future we build together. The joy that transformed Henry's face was worth every hardship she had endured. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, then gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, a promise of deeper passion to come, but respectful of her grief and the newness of their love. When they parted, Tabitha felt as if something final had healed within her, not erasing her past, but making space for a future she could embrace wholeheartedly. You know, Henry said, his voice husky with emotion, that first day when I said you were dressed in my love. I had no idea how true those words would become. Tabitha touched his cheek, marveling at how this man had wandered into her life exactly when she needed him most. And I had no idea that faded clothes could lead to such a vibrant future. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, Tabitha Dawson became Tabitha Gallagher in a small ceremony attended by their newfound friends and neighbors. She wore a dress of deep blue calico, handmade from the fabric Henry had admired that summer evening. Henry stood tall and proud beside her, his drifting days behind him, his heart finally home. As they spoke their vows beneath the autumn sky, with the mountains standing witness and their small herd grazing contentedly in the distance, Tabitha thought of all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment: a lamed horse, a storm, a poker game, and a faded dress that had caught a wanderer's eye and changed both their lives forever. That night, as husband and wife, they sat together on the porch of what was now truly their home. Henry wrapped a quilt around Tabitha's shoulders against the evening chill and pulled her close to his side. "Happy, Mrs. Gallagher?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Tabitha leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. "More than I ever thought possible again," she answered truthfully. Above them, stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like dreams waiting to be claimed. Promises of all the days and years that stretched before them, no longer faded, but vibrant with possibility and love.